Hello again, art history students. Welcome to another lecture for Unit 3. This is the lecture directly after Rome, and it's talking about early Christian art, the division of Rome, and then we're going to talk about the Byzantine Empire, and we're going to have discussions about icons and their power, and that's going to link to your discussion for this week, your discussion post. So directly above this video in Blackboard, there should be a link for a little TED Ed video that's about 5 minutes long. It's a cute little cartoon. It has a lot of information. So I'd really like, usually we, in the classroom setting, we watch that kind of like in the early to middle part of this lecture, but I kind of want you guys to go watch that first. There should be a note like, please watch this before the other um, video. So if you haven't done that, go watch that. You can pause this and come back to it, however you guys want to do it. So please watch that before you watch this one, and also make sure you've watched the first lecture of the unit, which is on Rome. All right, so we left off last time talking about, or kind of introducing this guy, which is Constantine the Great. This is part of his the remnants of his colossal statue. So if you watch that little video, you know that he's the first Christian emperor, that there was a division in Rome between East and West, right? Which was not specifically started by Constantine, but he's really the one that kind of formalized the split into two. Before that, it was kind of just like East and West provinces, and there was kind of different people in charge of East and West, but still it was considered one unified empire. And Constantine really broke that. And he's the first Christian emperor. So let's kind of get a little bit more into his information. This is the triumphal arch of Constantine. So this is the second triumphal arch that we've seen. We talked about the Arch of Titus in the last lecture. And if you remember, there was kind of this area inside of here that had, in the Arch of Titus, that had the triumph of the Romans over the Hebrews in that inside, and or the Israelites inside of that area. So let's kind of look inside of there and talk about the triumph of Constantine. So Maximus was the official emperor of Rome at this time, and Constantine was an important political figure, but he was certainly not the emperor. And he, there was then a civil war and a fight over who was going to be in control. Now, we talked last time about these kind of cults or these underground religious groups, and how the rule in Rome was that you had to believe in Roman um, the Roman religion, that pantheon of gods. So the big thing, one of the big reasons why I separate this lecture literally into two separate lectures, I separate Rome, is because there's this huge shift in ideas. So Constantine sees a vision from the Christian God, and then decides that he is going to become the emperor of Rome through this civil war, and then turn Rome into a Christian empire. So I've got this little like star down here. Constantine is not the one who officially um, split Rome. Like I said, it's this emperor called Diocletian. That's information that's not super relevant for this class. I just want to make sure you guys have all the information as possible. In 330, which is only not that long after this, that's when Constantine rose to power, and this split of the empire was much more solidified and much more separate. Okay, so like I said, there's this split that's happening. If you watch that little video, you know that the Rome, which was the capital of the Roman Empire, right? We talked about that, was then moved here to Constantinople, which is in current day Turkey. So this split also kind of splits our understanding of East and West, an East and West culture, which is important for art, right? When we think of the Western world, right, which we are part of here in the United States, we think of Europe, we think of this Western Roman Empire, and we kind of think of this area as the Middle East and then Asia as like the Far East. So even though this was a unified empire at one time, unified under a single kind of banner, our cultural understanding of sort of the lines of language and the lines of culture and the lines of idea kind of go through this separation between East and West. And also, like it said in the video, there isn't this, the people who lived in the Eastern Roman Empire, which is what pretty much this entire lecture is going to focus on, didn't see themselves as Byzantines. They didn't even have that word in their vocabulary. They viewed themselves as Roman citizens of the Eastern Roman Empire. All right, so this is the Basilica of Maximus and Constantine. This basilica, or this building, was started by Maximus, right, who was the official emperor when Constantine rose to power, we'll say, or conquered, or, you know, the Civil War, however you want to say it. He came into power. So he finished this building. So there's a couple architectural things that I want to point out because they may come back to haunt us. So the arch is still that Roman calling card, right? The arch is on just about everything that the Romans ever created. We talked about those coffering last time when we talked about the dome in the Parthenon or Pantheon, sorry. So we see that use of the coffering again here. There's kind of this octagonal scooping away of that excess, so that way there's a little bit less weight. And then this is also what's known as a vault. And a vault is basically like an arch that's extended into a hallway. So this whole area here is a vault. And we will see this building, although it is pretty much in ruin today, is still very important. So another thing I want to point out is this was started as a temple kind of complex, and then because Constantine was a Christian, it became a basilica and was kind of repurposed into a church. But Constantine was still a Roman, so there's still this massive statue to him inside of this church. Those Roman ideas of power and who's in power and who's in charge and who literally has the world in their hand, right? That kind of stuff isn't going away overnight. There's not this humbleness about Constantine that we in today's Christian society maybe kind of there's this idea of humility that certainly wasn't there. Constantine was very much still the emperor of Rome, in charge and using art to portray that power. All right, so there's major shifts in belief structures. The polytheistic religions of old, right, meaning the pagan religion or the polytheistic religion of Rome, is no longer practiced. It was no longer practiced by the large mass population. As Rome kind of slid into this split, it was kind of going a little bit on the decline when at this time frame there was no longer this extreme push, excuse me, for everyone to kind of follow those religions. And these other religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all kind of cropped up and are now the major, practiced by the major populations at this time. So they all have their origins in the Middle East. They're all monotheistic, and they all warn against the worship of false idols. I want you to keep this idea in mind as we move forward. This idea that false idols are images, and we are specifically talking about art history here. So this is going to be important as we move forward. All right, this is Old St. Peter's Basilica. This was the first church that was built as a church, right? From start to finish. So the Basilica of Maximus and Constantine was not started as a Christian building. It was started by Maximus, who was not a Christian. So here we have, this building no longer exists, just so you know, but here we have a fresco of a cutaway view of the building. And I want to draw your attention here to a couple things in this little kind of layout. So there's this rough shape of a cross built into the building. And then there's kind of this courtyard area that's happening out here. So this is kind of the inside of the building where the cross shape is, and then the outside is, well, I mean, it's covered, but there's this this other shape. So these two shapes are going to crop back up when we get to the Gothic period, and then this kind of courtyard shape here is going to become reminiscent when we talk about Islamic art and Islamic architecture, which is very, very important when you talk about Islamic art, is the architecture. So those two things are kind of a little bit of a preview of what's to come. All right, next we're going to talk about, just very briefly, Jewish artwork thrived in the Eastern Roman Empire, but due to various persecutions throughout history, very few Jewish artworks survive from this time. So I want to just take a moment to say, excuse me, that they were very prevalent, but there is a reason why we're not looking at a whole lot of them. So we're kind of talking about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and we'll kind of reference those for a while. The next, not the very next lecture in the series, but then after that will be an entire lecture on Islam and Islamic art, but we're not really diving into Judaism, and the reason for that is very few examples survive. So it's very unfortunate, and I just want to touch on that. So here is a fresco. This is again from a reconstruction. So this fresco is from the Old Testament. This was the fresco of the Exodus, when the Israelites, or the Hebrews, crossed the Red Sea, right? So this is Moses here. We're going to see a couple more depictions of Moses as we go into the future. So let's keep going. All right, so this is the Good Shepherd. This is a mosaic. So this is inside of a mausoleum, and we talked about catacombs and mausoleums and sort of these burial type chambers in the last lecture. And one of the things that was really important was that because of this persecution of various religions under Roman rule, the iconography was all blurred together, and it was very difficult to precisely pinpoint who believed in what, because there was that persecution. You had to be secretive about your true belief structures. And here we see that that is absolutely not the case. There is this loud, kind of loud and proudness of this main character here in the center with the halo holding the cross, draped in purple, which is a sign of royalty, right? So this person is who I believe in, right? That is definitely a loud, proud symbol here. This is also called a mosaic, which is made of these small pieces of glass called tessera, and they reflect light. This is very, very popular in the Byzantine Empire, or in the Eastern Roman Empire. So we're going to be looking at a couple more of those, and this term mosaic and this term tessera may or may not pop up on the quiz. So you might want to just kind of associate the mosaics with the Byzantine Empire. All right, again, so we're talking about this area of the world here, right? And then Rome is no longer the capital. We will later talk about everything that's going on over here. We will talk about that in a later lecture. Okay, Here we're kind of moving forward in time. This is another mosaic. So this is Constantine the Great presents the city of Constantinople, and then Justinian, who we're going to talk a lot more about, presents the Hagia Sophia, both to the Virgin Mary and Jesus. So we're seeing this merging of sacred realm space and real realm space. We're also seeing this separation of time. So this is Constantine here. I love these images from kind of the Gothic era and on into the Renaissance and whatnot. We will see these images when someone kind of devotes something to religion or devotes something that they have built or created or whatnot to a religious purpose. They kind of have these depictions of them presenting it as it's this small scale object. So there's this merging of sacred realm and real realm. There's this kind of symbolic distortion of scale as we see Constantine here holding the entire city of Constantinople, right? The walled city, and presenting it, right? And then we see Justinian here, and here he has Hagia Sophia, which you probably know from the little video. And then we have the Virgin here in blue. As always, there's this slight separation of architectural space as she and he are elevated, right? So they are in the sacred realm. So there's just this like slight kind of uplift of those two people, right? And again, this is all a mosaic. So Justinian the First is one of the biggest patrons of the arts in art history. He funded hundreds of churches and mosaics and paintings. He created the Hagia Sophia. The Eastern Orthodox Church was the first to kind of use icons and their creation, which is, we're going to talk more about icons, but the short version is that they are art that is created by religious venerated individuals, and then that art has religious power kind of imbued into it. And then during the iconoclasm, he protected more than 2,000 of those icons from destruction. So he made art and he saved art. He's a pretty big art history figure. So we're going to talk quite a bit more about him and break down a lot of this information as we go forward. All right, this is the Hagia Sophia. This is, like I said, in Constantinople at the time that we're talking about this, which is current day Istanbul in Turkey. So currently this building is a mosque kind of slash museum. It's still, its main purpose is devotion for a mosque, but you can take kind of historical tours of it and see some of the Christian artwork that's there. So these minarets, right, which we will learn about in a later lecture, these 5 kind of pillars are not originally part of the building. They go along with the Islamic tradition, the Islamic use that's there today. So it said in the little video that it was like this dome was kind of like held from like a chain from heaven, and we're going to talk more about that. I hope you watched that little video. It's only 5 minutes and I've referenced it many times. All right. So in the last lecture, when we talked about Rome proper, we talked about that dome that has the oculus, right? And there was kind of this rotunda. So it was kind of like a can shape. Oop, I'm terrible at drawing this right now. And then the dome sat on top of it. So the dome, the weight of the dome was equally distributed down in this circular form, right? So this usually requires kind of really thick walls. And if you want to expand the space past that circular rotunda, there becomes the difficulty of how the weight is distributed. So something called peditives are basically invented or created or used to do this. And these are basically 4 arches, if you can imagine 4 arches that come together to make a square, and then that square is actually what supports the dome. So the weight of the dome is going from here down and then down the peditive to the ground. Right? This can create a humongous, vast open space. This is the interior of the Hagia Sophia, right? So we have the large dome up here, and then you can clearly see the use of those peditives as they come down here, bringing all that weight. This really gives you some scale. If you can see the little people at the bottom there, that gives you, this is a vast, vast space. And without the use of peditives, without the invention of this, there was never the ability to make such a large, vast, high space. So the next kind of vocabulary word I want to introduce to you guys is clear story. And the definition here uses a couple words that we haven't actually gotten to yet. So I want you to listen to this is the official definition. I want you to kind of listen to my definition. So this is a row of windows where there is no architectural element above it. That is the basicness of a clear story. It's a little bit more complicated than that, as you can see from this section, but for our purposes, this section here is the clear story, right? It's right inside of that dome. Let's go to the next slide. The interior kind of little area around it is lined with gold mosaic tiles. So they would kind of reflect light down into the space, obviously. But whenever you're looking up at something that's bright from inside of a dimly lit area, and there is just a little tiny bit of space in between, the light kind of blurs it together. So you can imagine how people almost felt like the dome wasn't even attached to the building, right? Because they could barely see these kind of attachment areas as the light kind of came in. And you know what I'm talking about when you kind of look and then you can't see how things, because the light is not blinding you, but it kind of blurs things. You guys know what I'm talking about. So that is part of that reason. So the gold mosaic is reflecting that light, bringing even more light into the building. Right? So here is that clear story on the exterior of the building. Here are those peditives, right? This row of windows here cannot be considered a clear story because there's architectural elements above it, right? That's kind of the definition I want you guys to remember for this moment in this class. We will talk more about clear stories when we get to the Gothic era. So for now, there's gonna be a test question. I'm gonna ask you to identify where the clear story is on the building, either from this exterior image or from an interior image. All right, so more about Justinian. Right, so the last time when we talked about Rome in the last little video lecture, I showed you guys Augustus of Prima Porta, right? So it's that statue of that man, and he has the toga on, and he has that military kind of breastplate. He's got that outstretched arm. There was that little putti, right? That little baby that was at his leg, just to refresh everyone's memory. So we're looking here at Justinian, and he is telling us all about his power, just the same as Augustus of Prima Porta was, but he's doing it in a very different way. So this is Justinian here. Wait, let me get a color that kind of stands out. All right, so this is Justinian here, right? So he has this halo around his head, which signifies that intellectual kind of spiritualness, right? The head is the spiritual center of the body, right? So on this side of him, he has all of these people who are part of the clergy, right? These are religious individuals, right? They have the symbols of that. They have the cross, they have the Bible, and then they have, oh, I forget what this thing is called. They have this little thing which burns incense, right? And it's used in ceremonies. So there's still this clear use of iconography about power, right? Justinian has religious power, all to the one side of him. To the other side of him, he has these two guys here who are like political power people. I don't want to call them senators because this is not a democracy and that is a democratic term, but they are high-level advisors, right? I guess similar to a senator. And then over here on the other side, he has the military, right? Just past that. And then this here, this kind of P shaped, and then this X through it is called the Chi, and that is the symbol for Rome, right? So even though we're referring to this artwork as Byzantine and talking about Justinian as a Byzantine emperor, they never would have seen themselves that way. They always saw themselves as Romans. All right, so Justinian is saying in this artwork that he holds all the same kind of power that Augustus of Prima Porta held, right? He has religious power, he has military might, and he has this kind of political, intellectual power, which is what these two kind of guys here represent, right? So he has all that same power, but it's not all encompassed into one person like Augustus of Prima Porta is. It's a little bit more spread out, kind of representative of the fact that Justinian as one individual does not single-handedly hold all this power. So, all right, this is his wife, Theodora. She was just as important as Justinian. And there's this old saying that behind every powerful man is an equally powerful woman, or behind every great man is a great woman. I think that that statement probably originated in the Byzantine Empire with Justinian and Theodora. She was not a nobody, and certainly was not not involved, if you know what I mean. So here she is with her attendants, right? So she has she has a halo around her head, kind of signifying her spiritual enlightenment or her spiritual connection. And she's going, this little fountain here is before you would go into kind of like this little private temple area or private space, private chapel, I guess. You would wash up. You would like wash your hands and your face and whatnot before you would go into that. It's like a little cleansing type thing. So that is part of what we're seeing here. All right, this is in San Vitale. That is where these two mosaics exist, right, on each side there. And then we have this kind of Christian symbol here with the four kind of the main gospels around them. And we will get to all that information for the Gothic era. This is a little bit of like a precursor, but I want you to note that this is also in Italy. So it's not like the Western Roman Empire was like completely deserted, right? There was still definitely power over there, but not as much, and especially as we move forward in time into the Dark Ages. So I just wanted to put into context where those mosaics are. They actually don't exist in Constantinople. All right, so now we're talking about icons. So these are small paintings of religious figures that are believed to possess these healing powers. So they would be venerated by Christian believers. Basically, a member of the church or a designated individual who would create these icons, or group of people, I guess, there were many of them created, would make this object and they would somehow imbue it with spiritual power. And then as it was used, right, usually when they were used, they were believed to have healing powers. So they would be put kind of like above the bed of a sick person. Right? And then that healing power, this might not be an adequate analogy, but I think it's kind of like a sponge. Like this power is put in and then it can slowly seep out, and then an icon can also absorb more power, is kind of the idea behind them. So there comes this time when these icons, Christianity, like I said early in the lecture, there's this warn against the worship of false idols, right? Think of the golden calf or something of that nature. This fear that people, believers, would confuse these icons with spirituality or with the true belief or the true kind of Christian ideals. I don't want to get too into it because it's not necessarily what this class is. This is not like a religious studies class, but these objects are art objects that people were concerned about. So there became something called an iconoclasm. And an iconoclasm is the destruction of religious images other from within a group, right? So these are Christians destroying Christian images because they kind of have conflict with the images, right? Or by one group for another. The most recent iconoclasm that happened was in 2001. The Taliban destroyed a whole bunch of Buddhist statues that had stood for hundreds of years in Pakistan, and they destroyed them, uh, which was very, very sad for the world. And that's a example of one group destroying the images of another group. And I just want to clarify that that's a little bit different than what's going on here at this moment in history, which is the Byzantine Empire, right? This is a group internally destroying their own artwork. So they're very different, but I want you to know that they're both iconoclasms. They're both the destruction of religious images, either by an exterior group, like in current day, 2001 is the most recent example, the Taliban and the Buddhist statues, and then the Byzantine Empire. So that is an iconoclasm, right? The destruction of religious images. And then this word iconoclast is if you believe in that. So if you are a iconoclast, if you say Christians are confusing these images and thus we need to destroy them. That's like a term for a person, and an iconoclasm is an event, right? Just to kind of clarify that. So this conflict, these iconoclasts who were acting on this iconoclasm during this Byzantine Empire of the 8th and 9th century, Justinian believed that these objects maybe just needed to be taken out of circulation, but they needed to be saved. So he took thousands of these icons, over 2,000, to Egypt, which was in his empire, to Mount Sinai, which is the highest mountain in Egypt, for their protection. So let's look at some of these icons. I've given you a lot of information about them, so let's break them down. So this one is the Virgin and Child surrounded by saints. So we have a couple things here. We have the Virgin Mary and the Child, right? She is always in blue. Mary is always in blue. She's slightly elevated from these other two figures, which are saints, which exist in our realm, right? So they're kind of physically lower. There's this slight separation of architecture, right? And then there's these kind of angels in the background. This is also an encaustic. That's a word that we learned during, I didn't mean to cross it out, I meant to underline it. That's a word that we learned during last lecture, which is a wax painting, usually on wood. Let's break down another one. This one is probably one of the most famous icons. This is the Christ icon. And I want you guys, I wish that we were in class together because I always ask students how this person looks, right? So this is Christ, this is Jesus. And if you look at him, his face looks kind of off. One side of it looks okay, and then the other side is kind of drooping, almost like, I say this like a joke, almost like he's had a stroke or something, like one side is not doing so well. So on the note of those two sides, one is kind of even in shadow from the other, right? And we can see kind of on the neck, there's two objects or two things going on those two sides. And one is that blessing hand, which we've talked about before in class. And then the other is holding the book, the Bible. So let's remember where these are placed. These objects are often placed because they're believed to have healing powers over the bed of someone who is likely going to pass away, someone who needs healing, not like broken arm healing, like someone who is in the last moments of their life. So what we're seeing here is this realm, the real realm, the physical realm, and the sacred realm put right next to each other. So the Bible, which is like, this is the Christian book, right? The Christian word that exists in this realm, right? And then the blessing, which exists in the sacred realm, right? This side of the face represents the decay of this life, right? The same space that the book exists in. And then the sort of healthy happiness of the other side of the face represents that eternal sacred realm. So we're seeing the real realm and the sacred realm displayed right next to each other. I do not have a photo credit of where this came from, but I think when you see these images mirrored like this, it really, really kind of clearly should, they don't even look like the same person. All right, so this is kind of a representation of sacred realm and then real realm, and this is the merging of them together, right? So I want you to remember this one. This is the actual icon, but I just kind of like to put this slide in just so you can kind of get a little bit more context. All right, this is another example that also depicts that real realm and sacred realm division. So we have Mary and then the Christ child up on her lap. He's also got that awesome little blessing hand, right? We're going to see that over and over again. And then we have this separation through architecture of these people who are down below, who are very likely saints or priests or important, maybe even important people in the community, maybe the person who paid for the object to be created. And then above that is the sacred realm. So remember that these objects were really important and really viewed as almost like living, breathing artwork. Okay, so I'm going to take 1 second and just, if you've got any questions, please email them to me. I'm super happy to email and answer questions. You guys know that. All right, now we're going to move on to kind of the discussion part. I wish that we were in class together for this. This is a discussion where I really try to get everyone involved. So I want to bring this Russian or this icon idea forward into the future to today. And we're going to talk about Russia a little bit. So here we have an example of a Russian Orthodox icon, right, that was created in both 1490 and 1730. So this icon has an original kind of like core here, and then it was added to at a later date. So that kind of frame that goes around it with all those images, that's from 1730. So it's a pretty big time gap. And again, these objects, I like that kind of analogy of the sponge, right? If you're, as artists are making them and people are kind of praying to them for others and whatnot, which was part of the iconoclasm, was that people were kind of using these objects like religious, but there's this idea that this object absorbs power and then releases power back out. So they can be revisited physically and added to. So today in Russia, these are used in these festivals. I'm going to say that, use that word kind of lightly. They obviously coincide with certain religious holidays. I know that Easter is one of them, and these icons are actually taken out and paraded around. And that is part of their absorption and then release of this religious power, is that as they're taken out and paraded around in the community, they can, do their sponge religious thing, coming in and going out. So these are used today. Easter is one of the biggest times that they're kind of taken out and paraded around. We can also see that this one started out as wood and then was put metal over it, and now it's in kind of this big elaborate framed box. So the icon is actually this small thing, and everything that's around it is kind of like for its protection. And it has probably bulletproof glass in front of it and whatnot. So let's take a moment and I'm going to give you guys a super brief um, Russian history lesson. So in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church was very powerful, and that's who all of these icons kind of belonged to. And then communism rose, and under communist rule, everything is diverts to the power of the state, right? And religion was very kind of pushed aside at this time. It wasn't like illegal, but a lot of this power was taken away, and it wasn't very uh, didn't it wasn't no longer able to own these icons because it took them outside and paraded them around, which ultimately led to their potential destruction, right? This one had to be repaired, right? It has that wooden core and then metal over top of it, probably because it was damaged in one of those times that it was taken outside in this parade. And the Russians believed at that time that they needed to preserve these objects, that their preservation was so much more important. And they were cultural objects, right? That talked about Russia rather than these kind of religious objects. All right. So that happens during the rise of communism in Russia. Fast forward to the fall of communism in Russia, and the Russian Orthodox Church comes back in full power, right? When just as powerful as it was before communism ever fell. And they say, hey, museum that took all of our icons, we want those back. So this creates the conflict of where do these objects belong? What are they? Do they belong to the church and should just be taken back out of the museum, and whether their destruction happens or not, is that's who they belong to, or should they be preserved? All right, so I'm moving to this slide to kind of, in this moment in class, we would more than likely, I would kind of get you guys' opinions. Who thinks the church? You know what I mean? And we would kind of start a dialogue. But for this purpose of this little lecture thing, all I'm going to do is kind of give you 2 points and then counterpoints. So if you think, well, they obviously belong to the church, right? That might be something that you might be thinking. And to that, I would say, okay, that might be true, but I'm going to use myself as an example for both of these kind of counter arguments, just because it's easy for me to poke fun at myself. And there's also this connection, right? You guys don't really know me, but at the same time, I hope that you don't wish me harm. So let's say that I am the same person, exactly the same person, and my love of art is just so strong, and I want to go visit these objects and see them. But I'm not just Lacey, I am a Muslim version of myself, right? And I have to wear the hijab. And thus, I cannot hide that my belief is different than the belief of the people in this church, in this Russian Orthodox Church. Could I go see that image, right? I want to see it from an art history point of view. I want to see it because I love art history and I think these icons are fascinating, right? Everything's the same, but I can't hide who I am and that my belief structure is different than the belief structure of this church. Would I be safe, right? Um, would I be, would it be confrontational? Could I run into a confrontation? Could I go there? Would I even be allowed in, right? So that becomes the idea of, well, maybe they shouldn't belong to the church because they're no longer cultural objects. The museum is a very safe place, right? It has this distance and this welcomingness for all groups, whereas the church doesn't. So, on the other hand, you could say, all right, I think museums should have these objects and that they should be preserved for future generations and, you know, no longer kind of part of this religious thing. So the argument comes with that is this. I'm going to go to the next slide. Is the intention versus the preservation. And this is what I want your thoughts on for the discussion for this week, is kind of what has precedent? What should we value in art history? Should we let something be used for its intention, knowing that it may cause its ultimate destruction? Or should we preserve everything without it ever being used, right? So another example from another culture is Japanese tea ceremony bowls. I showed you one way back in like lecture 3, I think, of the beginning of the semester. And I told you that the tea bowl kind of has this little rim, which is a little landscape. And then when we talked about the Jomon culture and we did the Jomon lecture, I told you that one of those Jomon pots was used in the Japanese tea ceremony, and they actually lacquered the inside of it. I had to make a note about that so that way you knew that it didn't look like that originally. So should that object have never been used in a Japanese tea ceremony, never been changed or touched, right? Because it should have been preserved, right? Or should we let the intention of the object change and grow, right? Taking these objects out, which could potentially destroy them, is part of their intention. It's part of their process and what they are. So I really wish we were all in class together. But there's no right or wrong to this. And if you are conflicted about it, that's okay. If you say, well, I can see both sides of the argument, that's okay. Like I said, there's no right or wrong. This is just kind of, I have different feelings about it. I think that I go back and forth and I have that conflict, and that's okay because we all live in the real world, and conflict, if you are conflicted about it, that means that you can see both sides of the argument. So your credit, since there is no right or wrong, the credit is going to come from your justification. So don't just tell me your opinion on it. Don't just be like, yep, I'm with preservation. Don't do that. You have to cite some examples. You have to explain a little bit. Give me roughly 2 paragraphs or 100-ish words for full credit. You can't just say intention is best and then think that you're going to get full credit. Some of you did that for one of the other discussions, and it was not enough. So, all right. These are the vocabulary words for this lecture, and please email me if you don't know what any of these are. I am always happy to help, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you so much.